As you notice, this talk is in English. Unfortunately, I don't know any Russian or Ukrainian. You can teach me probably. Also, my first language is not English, so as much as you can have a difficulty understanding English, for me, speaking in English is also difficult. So we are very challenged. The other thing is, well, about me is I work at Microsoft in the Entity Framework product team. I have been working in this team for 4 years. Since I started at Microsoft, I started there, and I love the product. I didn't like what we did in the first version very much, but I kept pushing with other people to improve, to listen to customers, and I'm now very proud of what we have. I understand that because of the difficulty of the language, and because of the fact that I also tend to speak very quickly, and I tend to invent new words, and also to use 3-letter acronyms a lot. If at any point you don't understand something I said, please raise your hand, and I'll try to get somebody to translate or something. Also, if there is any funny joke there, please raise your hand and let me know. Okay, let's see if this works. Oh, yes. Well, the idea in this talk is that we take a look at what's coming. So I found this picture that seems to be very graphical. The thing I want to spend some time talking about, like the last stuff that we have been working on, the code first API. Basically, I'm going to speak a little bit about the history of the EF, and then I'm going to move a little bit more into things that we are working on currently and that we are going to release in the near future, hopefully. And finally, I'm going to show a demo and show a little bit, like the demo is already finished, but I'm going to show the code. I'm going to try to put some breakpoints so that we can see step by step how it works. But it's basically an application that is a Metro-style application in Windows 8 that is using Entity Framework on the server side. Okay, so talking about the history of the EF. In the beginning, there was EF version 1. Now we are using animals to describe EF because one very well-known evangelist called Scott Hanselman decided that the new version was called the Magic Unicorn Edition. So we tried to figure out what the first version would be called, and it's something like the donkey that doesn't have any love or something like that. And it was a very basic object relational mapper that we decided to release. At that point, to be honest, we were not sure that it was an object relational mapper. It was just a tool to do data access and to do code generation and things like that. And it only supported, to build useful applications, a workflow that we call database first, which is basically you point the entity designer to an existing database, and you can reverse engineer the schema of the database into a model. And now we also do code generation of some classes, and you can start writing a program that uses those classes. We got a lot of feedback. We got even some people that took the time to create a vote of no confidence for Entity Framework because it was so basic. So we started working a lot, and we created what we call EF4. Some people make a joke that we skipped from V1 to V4 because we wanted to make it look like we were really doing a lot. But the actual reason was we wanted to align with the version of the .NET Framework, and since the EF was part of the .NET Framework 4, in this case we wanted to say ACE, EF4 the same way that ASP.NET 4 is the version that comes with .NET 4. The main features that we work on this were support for POCO. POCO means plain old CLR objects. How many of you actually use Entity Framework or have used? Wow, that's nice. It's about half of people. And how many of you are familiar with Entity Framework, although you don't use it? Okay, So if I union the two sets, I guess I get almost everybody. So when lack of support for plain old CLR classes is one of the main problems that we had in the first version, and that's about supporting classes that are just your classes you provide, that don't inherit from any special type or don't have to implement any special interface. They just have some simple patterns. And once you provide a class that complies with those patterns, we can use it as an entity for the EF. The other thing that we added support for lazy loading, mix of POCO and lazy loading also, and much more rich solution for code generation based on T4. Also, support for foreign keys was quite important. And on the designer side, we made progress. We added, alongside the database first workflow that we already had, we added the ability to say, hey, I want to create this model. I will just create some boxes for my entities and some arrows for all the relationships. And now automatically I want to get the script to create the database for that model. That wasn't possible in the first version. So here comes the unicorn. After we released 4.0, we started working on a version of EF that wasn't part of .NET. The idea is that we build this new version of EF, but on top of what is already in 4.0, we are all the time using public APIs that are in 4.0, but we enable some new features that are not possible with just .NET. And the main two things that we did were code first, which is the ability to just create a model without using the designer and just writing some code. And also this new DB context API, which is a simplified version of our data access API. And of course, that is what comes after this, and we're going to talk a little bit more later. So one thing that is becoming more complicated is because we started releasing versions of EF outside .NET. It's like we now have like a constellation of different components that live in different places, and we ship them in different, what we call shipped vehicles. Like we ship some things as part of .NET still, and some things outside. And I want to clarify a little bit this constellation of things. Is it possible to read from everywhere, or is it too small? It's okay? So basically what ships in .NET Framework is the core of EF, the assembly that is called System Data Entity, DLL, and also the entity data source, which is this ASP.NET Web Forms component that makes it simple to write an app with EF. And there are also design time components for those two. Now, in Visual Studio, we continue to ship the entity designer. We had it in the first time, and we'll have it in the next one also. Now we are using NuGet. How many of you are familiar with NuGet? Cool. It's almost like 40%. For the version that we ship outside of .NET, NuGet is our preferred way of releasing it. So from now on, we are actually going to only release it as NuGet packages. And we have basically two. There is Entity Framework, and there is Entity Framework.migrations, which is some technology we're going to talk a little bit about, and is something that is in preview mode right now. There is also an Entity Framework.preview package that we use for the current experimental version or the current version that is in development. And finally, we have some components that we release outside all of the above, and we release them in the Visual Studio Gallery because it's much more convenient. The main things that we have there are the EF Power Tools, which is a nice tool that allows you to do some things with code first very easily. And the code generation templates. Like we have this new API, the DB Context, the Simplified Data Access API. There is a template that can take a model, an EDMX file, and can generate code that uses this DB context. And that one is not part of Visual Studio. You have to find it in the Visual Studio Gallery. So let's show a little bit of this. I want to show basically what is in Entity Framework 4.1. So let's start from scratch. I wasn't planning to start from scratch, but then I realized that I forgot to create this. So let's say we create a console application. You don't see, good point. Thanks, guys. So this doesn't work very well here, so I guess now I need to type like this. Okay, I'm going to create a new simple console application. Oh, it's not even all of it there, but hopefully. This is a kind of a fancy machine because I installed a Windows 8 on it, and not everything is working correctly. So it's a preview version. I'm going to take a few shortcuts. For instance, one thing that is not working in this machine is NuGet. Actually, I installed it several times, and I talked to the people in NuGet, and they couldn't help me make it work. So although I said NuGet is the preferred version of installing EF, I'm going to use just add reference in this case. And I'm going to go to folder I have. Okay. So this added entity framework here. And if you look at the properties, I want this to be a 4.5. The new version of .NET that is in development together with Windows 8 and everything is 4.5, in case you haven't heard. So I'm going to use these two things together. And I'm going to start just defining some classes. So let's say public class, let's say person, my favorite example, has an ID property and a string name property. And let's say we have another public class event that also has an ID and a string name. Property, and also events have an organizer, so this is, I'm thinking about creating a model that has an event that has organizers. I'm going to just say a person organizer, and this, I should make it public also. Get and set. How many of you have used code first? Okay, around 30%, I believe. I have a very special talent to calculate when I see people like this very quickly. Okay, so here is my model. Oh, this one doesn't work? Oh, okay. That's fine for me. Hello. This is my special voice. Oh, it's too loud, huh? I don't know. Well, I'm just thinking that my application is going to need objects like this, so I just write the classes. And that's the good thing about code first, that I don't need to create the database up front. Now, I'm going to need like a context class that is actually like a container for those classes. And I'm going to create it like this. And I inherit from a class that is called DBContext, that is part of EF. Oops. And I'm going to add a couple of properties for the sets. So this has to be a DB set of person, and I'm going to call it people. And this set of event, and I'm going to call it events. So if I do this, I have my model almost ready, and I can start using it. So let's say I have a using statement. And here I'm going to start adding some data to the database. So let's say that I'm a person. Something like that. And I have my birthday. So oops. And I want to say context dot, well, I probably want to specify the organizer here. And I want to say, okay, context dot events dot add birthday. And now I want to save this data. And let's try to see what happens. So I created a context, I create a couple of classes, I connect them, and I now say, okay, I want to add this. And I save it. And here on the right, this IntelliTrace technology is telling us exactly what's going on. You'll see that this application tried to connect to a database, tried to find the database several times. I think this microphone is not working very well for me. Is it working for you guys? Yeah? Okay. It tried to connect to a database that didn't exist. It found that it didn't exist. Then it ran a query on the master database to see if it could find a database with that name. Since it couldn't find a database with that name, it issued a script to create the database. It specified all the schema of the database automatically also. And then it started like issuing insert statements against the database. So what happened is basically code first, based on the shape of these types here and based on a number of conventions that code first implements, decided that you needed a database. It looked at the name of the type here and said the database by default has to have that name. Because it couldn't find the database, it said, okay, I need to create it. I'm going to, by convention, also look into the local instance of SQL Express. And then it generated a model that looks like these classes, and it also created the database for it. and it inserted all the data. So the number of things that you need to do to have this application or this kind of sample running is very small compared with all the steps that you used to have to do. And that's thanks to the conventions, basically. Of course, there are times that I want to change this model. And for instance, typical things that I want to do is I want to say the max length of this thing is limited. I don't have the right. I need to stop this. That's the problem. And I need to add the right references. For instance, with this annotation that I'm putting in this name property, I'm saying, okay, the max size of that column has to be 128. I cannot have like arbitrary strings. And whenever I do something like this, or let's say I also say, well, I want to specify a new property. Say this is date, time, when. I now want to run my application again, and I'm going to see that I have problems because typically now I cannot stand up. I changed the schema basically because I changed the shape of my classes, and now the database is out of sync with my classes. And really to go create the database or to go modify the database and keep it synchronized with the classes is very difficult. So for EF 4.1, we added one thing that we call database initializers. That is something that you can use in development, but we don't recommend using in production. That is basically programmatically create the database again whenever the schema change. Of course, you don't want to do that when you are in production. I'm going to use it here just to get out of trouble. So before I do this, I'm going to say database.setInitializer. I have two initializers here, and there are more, but one is basically every time I run my application, I'm going to create the database again, and the other one does some comparisons, and it only recreates the database if there are changes. So I'm going to use the second one. And now, if I restart, okay, I have a completely unrelated problem here because I forgot to add a property. Okay. Hello. Can you hear me? Okay. Anyway, In this case, I wasn't trying to make this break this way. It's an accident. But the idea is basically I can, anytime while I am in development, I can use these database initializers to just make it easy for me to change the model and create the database whenever I need it. But of course, that's not what people want to do. People usually have useful information in the database that they don't want to lose every time they change the classes or they add a property or they do any arbitrary change. They want basically that existing data to migrate from the current schema of the database to the new schema. And they want usually to do that in a very controlled manner because they don't want to be executing like scripts to modify the database against a database that has very valuable information. So let's go back to the slides. And I think the main what I need to do is minimize this. Okay. So let's take a look a little bit at things that the EF supports in general. We support scenarios in which you have a new application, you need to create just a new database, and you don't care about, you don't have existing data, or you don't have existing schemas. But we also support scenarios in which you have existing data and existing databases, and you want to just create a new application that uses that data. But also on another axis, on another dimension, we have developers that are more like visually oriented, and they want to somehow visualize the models that they create in their applications. For instance, in this case, like boxes and arrows. Entities are boxes, arrows are associations. And for the first case, like the combination of new database and this designer-centric developer, there is a very well-known pattern. We call that model first. You just create the model and then you generate the database from it. And for the second case, with an existing database, we have this reverse engineering ability to create the model from the database. But now for code first, what we think is that there is a different kind of developer that is more code-centric, and the way they want to work with their models is just code. And they don't have a problem with visualizing the model like this, and they actually prefer not to have external artifacts to the code that are going to specify how things are going to work. And Code First is a solution for both existing databases and new databases. Code First can be used in both ways. It's not always going to create a database for you. You can turn that off and you can use it to map to an existing database. So migrations. I'm going to explain this a little bit, and one of the reasons, one of the things I mentioned before is that NuGet is not working in this machine. For that reason, the demo that goes with migrations, I'm going to show a video from the build conference. So excuse me for that. It wasn't my intention, but I couldn't make it work. But the basic idea, is it possible to read or is it too small? It's okay? And from behind, is it okay? Yes? Well, the idea is that you have a class. For instance, I have my event class and I added this max length to specify I want this to be constrained to just 128 characters. Now, migrations allows you to execute a command. You can do it from the command line today in the alpha version, but you can also do it visually when we RTM. That is going to compare the existing model against what is generated considering this new change in your code, and it's going to generate code that looks like this. It's basically a script that is using a Fluent API in C# or in Visual Basic if your project is in Visual Basic, that specifies what changed. And in this case, it's saying, okay, in the table events, the column name now has to have this constraint that is the maximum length is 128. Now, from that Fluent API, from those scripts, there is another step that you can execute in the command line saying update database that generates the corresponding script for the database. And people that are familiar with databases may find an error here. I'm not expert in this kind of. I write link and SQL queries, but not data definition language a lot. And finally, you execute that script and you get your database up to date. You can do it automatically, or you can say, I give this script to the DBA, and the DBA is going to review it before he executes that. But the value of migrations is that it does all of this automatically. So I'm going to show a video of this. Now, the one thing with showing a video is that maybe the audio is not going to be good. Sergey, are you there? Is there a way to connect this to an amplifier, or should I just explain while we see the video? So the audio is going to go out of the speakers here. But nobody's going to listen unless I put the microphone there or something like that. We can try that. This one stopped working. I don't know what happened. I don't know. Let's try. Okay, by the way, these guys, I work with them. One is Jeff Derstad. He's the developer leader for the EF. And the other one is David De Winter, and he's a tester in the team. And he's a very good speaker. So let's see what they do. No? It was my fault.
A demo of that in action. So we'll switch back to our project, and the way you get started with Entity Framework migrations is you install a NuGet.
Is it possible for you to understand what he says?
Yeah. Okay. Package. So we'll go down here, and instead of using the UI, I'm going to use the Package Manager console, and we can install the package. Install package, except for I want my local feed. Entity Framework migrations. And what it did was it added a new assembly in my references, Entity Framework.migrations. And it also scaffolded out this class for us called settings. And what settings is asking us to do first is saying, tell me about the context you're going to be evolving. So I'll fill that in here. Put your code first context type name here. And that's our social context. And the rest of our settings file just has options that we can tell Entity Framework migrations about. So for example, should we generate the code using C# or VB? And what kind of database are we going to? In our case, we're still going against SQL Server, so we can close our settings file. Now we've made our code change, so let's run our first Entity Framework migrations command. So we'll run add migration, and we'll give it a change, a name called first updates. We'll hit enter. It's going out and doing a diff between our new model and our previous model, and you can see that it scaffolded out some code for us. So let's take a look at that. So you can see here's the code that we need to get our database back in sync. And it's kind of like a Fluent API in C# here. So we're creating a table called attendance, and we've defined the properties here, event ID and person ID, and you can see we defined the data types, and primary keys and foreign keys. And it also picked up that we're changing a column. We're changing that name column on the events table, and we're redefining it as a non-nullable string with a max length 128. And those changes really came from those data annotations that we put there. Now, the other thing I want to point out about migrations is kind of where Entity Framework migrations decided to store the file. So they're stored here in a little folder called migrations. And you can see the file name has this really hot name with a giant timestamp on it. And what that does is it just helps Entity Framework migrations know which migration steps have been applied to different databases and what order to apply them in. So you get a lot of control over what's happening to your database with this solution. So once you have the script the way that you want it, you can type in update database, hit enter. It saw that we hadn't yet applied this particular migration step, and so it applied it for us. We can go over to our Server Explorer again, we'll pin that, and if we refresh our tables, we can see that we now have the attendance table, which is our join table that it created, and if you look down here, you can see that the name column has been updated to an nvarchar 128, and it's no longer nullable.
Okay. That's all I wanted to do. Thanks, Jeff. Okay, so can I turn this off now? Yes. So what's in EF-BNX? Actually, there is no such thing, single thing that is called EF-BNX. We, as I explained before, we have multiple release vehicles now, and we are trying to be as agile as we can. So whenever we have an opportunity to release new functionality, we release it. But there are some constraints. Like, for instance, because we have NuGet, we are going to be releasing entity framework migrations relatively soon. It's going to be possible for us to complete this new feature and release it as a separate NuGet package. But for many other features, we need to wait until .NET Framework 4.5 releases. Those are typically features that require modifications in the core of EF, the assemblies that I explained before that we release as part of .NET. And for instance, enum support, which is not a big feature really, but it's the most requested one among our customers. How many of you that use EF wanted to use enums and you couldn't? You see why it's so requested. I was the PM actually for that feature, and I can tell you that it's working very well. But you need to wait until the next version, unfortunately. We are adding also spatial support, which is the ability to use geography and geometry types that SQL Server, for instance, supports. And you can now write link queries that performs like comparisons of distance or things like that in the server using link. Sorry. The other thing that we are adding is table valued functions. It's like, if you're not familiar with that, it's like a store procedure, but it takes parameters, and at the same time it gives you something that looks like a table, so that, or like a view, and it's composable. You can use those table valued functions in link queries now. On the other side, we are doing a number of performance optimizations. So for instance, now compile query. How many of you are familiar with compile query? Do you like the kind of code that you need to write to use compile query? Yeah, me either. So we were worried about that, and we had customers that told us, really, I have like an army of developers here, and none of them want to use this API. Just make regular link faster. And the way we did it is basically we create a representation of the expression tree, and we use that against a dictionary to basically cache all the queries. Something that for us was easy using entity SQL queries, but it was impossible using link. We worked to make it possible in the next version. So there is a big performance improvement here. We have seen in tests that in a regular application, like the typical pet shop standard performance test, the improvement of performance is 25% using the next version of EF. To that, we added another improvement that is the parameter evaluation that happens on link queries. Every time you have a variable that is captured in the link query, we need to also evaluate that to pass it. And that used to be a very expensive thing. We made an improvement. We gained another 25%. So now we are 50% faster in the next version of EF than this version. This is average. Of course, it depends on what model and what queries you are writing, but that's what we saw in our internal benchmarks. The other thing is, well, we are optimizing other queries. The main scenario that we had many complaints about was there is a strategy for inheritance that is TPT, or table per type. that used to be very inefficient, and now it has improved a lot. Another thing that we are doing is support for store procedures that return multiple results. So you can go get the next result. Basically, there is a method that is get next result. And you don't need to execute multiple store procedures to get many things. You just execute it once and you keep getting more data. And finally, in the next version of Visual Studio, the one that is going to be released around the same time as .NET 4.5, there is going to be a new version of the Entity Designer that is going to contain many new features, but the two most important ones are the ability to have multiple diagrams for the same model. Like you can have themes, and you say, okay, I have a very big model, 100 entities, but I have some entities that are associated with the customer, then I am going to have like pages. And I have a pages that is for customers, and I put all the things that are associated directly with the customer there, and then I have another page for, I don't know, employees. And there is a database project integration. There is a new product in SQL coming from SQL that is, I don't remember if they have an official name already, but they used to be called the code name Juno. And we have integration with that. And there is also the ability to colorize the entities in the model, which is a very small feature, but it's a nice one. So the last thing that I want to do in the last 2 minutes that I have for this talk is to show you this demo that is a Metro-style application using EF. And I'm going to quickly show you like the different components. First of all, we have a service. Let's say we have a service that was built using Entity Framework. I have a standard. Oh, again, thanks. We have a standard POCO classes for events, event categories, and persons, or sorry, people. My English is terrible. Then we have some configuration. We did some configuration using a pattern that we like for code first here. All the configuration goes in a class for each type. We have the context class that is, again, a very simple DB context thing with some customization of the model on creation. And we have the service that is an OData service based on this context. In a recent preview of DB context, they enabled the ability to use a DB context directly. It used to be the case that you needed to go through some interface to get the underlying object context and then expose that, but now it supports directly using a DB context. And we just specify which sets we want to expose, and this service is running already. On the other side, we have this application that I want you to see. And this is a Metro application. I don't know if you have played with the preview of Windows 8 and the tools that come with it, but it's very similar structurally to a Silverlight application. It uses SAML also to define the user interface, but the set of libraries that you use is different and is actually tied to the new Windows runtime. However, it's very similar. If you have developed using Silverlight, it's very likely that your skills are going to port to this environment very easily. In this case, we have a SAML file that defines the user interface for the application, and the main piece of code that we have there is this method that is going to populate the user interface based on a call to an OData service, and it executes a query that basically takes all the categories and expands events and attendees, and then it binds the results. One thing that you can notice here is that we are using the new thing probably you are not familiar with this, but how many of you have heard about the new async features in the .NET 4.5? Okay, so the ability to use await to wait asynchronously is something that, in this case, we added to the OData client using just an extension method, but it's something that we plan to add natively in the API. So we want to have async versions of the methods, like in this case, execute. We want to have the execute async that returns a task, so you can use this a simple way of executing asynchronously. So let's take a look at what happens here. I'll just put a breakpoint. And this is going to flicker a lot. That's the reason I'm using like 2 monitors, is because it didn't work very well earlier, but I want you to see the UI. Oh, cool. Okay, so now this thing went through my service to find this data, and it's populating the UI based on database in the database, including pictures of people in the entity framework team. This is Jeff, David, myself, Arthur, one of the main developers of EF, and this is our new dev manager. And this is basically like an application, a metro-style application for events. It's flickering a lot, but in my screen, not in yours. You're lucky. I hit the same thing again. Okay, so let's remove the breakpoint. So I wanted to show you this, but I want to explain a little bit how this works. So let's go back to the slides if I have 1 more minute. Okay, so the idea is that you have a database that could be a database local to your service, or it could be a database in SQL Azure, for instance. And you wrap it with, well, you create a data model using either code first or some other way of creating your model using model first or database first with EF. You wrap that into a WCF data service. Is something that is super simple to do. Is usually just 1 line of code. And now that's exposed. And because there is a version of the OData client running inside the Metro environment, you can now access that data through the service. One thing that is interesting also, we have another technology that we own that is called Data.js, and it's basically an OData client for JavaScript. So when you are executing, not what you are executing, when you decide to develop new Windows applications using HTML5 and JavaScript, you can also use this OData service. The example that I showed was using the thing below, which is SAML and .NET. So here are a few, well, one thing is, because of what I showed before, it means that EF in this new world of Metro-style applications, it becomes a server-side technology. You are not going to be executing EF inside the Metro environment. This environment doesn't even have SQL client. It doesn't even have ADO.NET. It only can connect to an external service, or it can save things in a file system, or there is even a row-based store for that. But it doesn't have like a full ADO.NET. Here are some resources, things that may be interesting for me. The first bullet is the most important, and is we have a site for feature voting, and anytime you have an idea of something that you care about, you can go to that site and search for ideas that other people already submitted, and see if it's not there, you just add a new item, and people are going to start voting on it. Currently, we have, in the next version, we are implementing several of the things that we had at the top of the list. Well, the other thing that is interesting, this msdn.com/ef is like the starting point whenever you want to learn about EF. Well, this is our MSWish site. Support for enums is by far the highest one, then more code first. Includes SQL generation. We are actually doing a lot of things here. And our two blogs, we use one to release to disclosure basically designs of things that we are going to do in the future. That's the EF design blog. And also we have the team blog for AD.NET that we use to do announcements and things like that. So thank you. Spasiba and gracias, actually.